So we are excited to be welcoming Dr. Yuki Kato today to discuss her current research on urban agriculture pivots during the pandemic. Dr. Kato is an assistant professor of sociology and a Center for Social Justice, Food Justice Fellow at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. She is an urban sociologist whose research interests intersect the subfields of social stratification, food and environmental justice, culture, consumption, and symbolic interaction. She has conducted research on urban agriculture and the alternative food movement in post-Katrina New Orleans, with a particular focus on food access, disparity, spatial and social landscapes of alternative food activism, and contested meanings of local during a major urban transformation. I also want to note that among her recent publications is an excellent co-edited volume with Alison Alcon and Joss Sabika called A Recipe for Gentrification that addresses how the everyday practice of eating in one city reflects the rapid and contentious changes taking place. And I've certainly really enjoyed reading through that volume. So thank you, Dr. Kato, for coming today, and I will turn it over to you to get us going.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and thank you everyone for joining us. Let me quickly do this so that I can start to share. So thank you again for this invitation to share my work today. This is a work in progress, and so I appreciate any feedback you can share as we continue our data collection and analysis processes in coming months. And let's see. So this project was initiated last summer when I was invited to speak with a group of government agencies and local nonprofit that were working with urban agriculture, and they were all sort of reporting that something is happening. They were, seeing a lot of different patterns of adaptations among the groups of urban growers that they were seeing, and they were just sort of looking at each other, going, "Well, somebody should do something." And of course, my hand went up. I was like, "I'll do it," and I was fortunate to be able to find collaborator in Caroline Bullis, who is at University of Maryland. And so she and I are currently sort of working on two separate projects that we hope to combine. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But to get us started, there you go. So this image of empty shelf immediately following the initial lockdown from the pandemic is probably very much vivid in many of our memories, which was often juxtaposed to these images of food being destroyed in rural farms. This is a case of milk being dumped, and trying to make sense of the fact that we are lacking food, but at the same time, food was being wasted. And a lot of us really were wondering out loud, what is wrong with our food system? How do we fix it? And I think in that conversation, interest in local food, mostly local rural farms, but also urban agriculture, I think the interest in it came out of that sort of interest in fixing this failed system. At the same time, separately from the conversation around food system, it seems that there was an increasing interest in gardening in general. This was one of the activities that people were able to do outdoor, and maybe there was something about the self-efficacy that you get from growing your own food during the time of major reflection for many of us, going back to the basic. And so perhaps this is really another factor to consider. Another thing that I want to also mention in thinking about last year, it wasn't just pandemic, but also there was a major social movement, particularly from thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement. There has been increasing conversation about structural injustices. And so when thinking about how urban agriculture adapted to the changes, I don't want to just think about the pandemic as a separate incidents, but there were so many other things that were happening last year. And so that's just really in the context of how we came to want to understand how urban agriculture was impacted by and responded to the pandemic of 2020. Apologies. So when I say urban agriculture, I think many of you probably had a very specific image in mind, and these are all images that probably maybe fit some of your ideas of what urban ag looks like. But there is a many different kinds of things that gets grouped into this idea of urban ag. And so here, there are backyard gardens, right? There's a community garden, school garden, urban farm. These are all different kinds of ways of growing, but they're all categorized as urban ag. It could be for-profit, nonprofit, many different ways of growing, which is really what you see here in the picture. And they don't just grow food. There are many different kinds of activities that take place in urban farms. And so this is something that I would like all of us to remember as I move forward in today's talk. That it isn't just one thing. And so some of us might be more comfortable or more familiar with the urban farms versus community garden, but I'm trying to capture the kind of a range of things that are happening in the city. There's also history of urban agriculture being considered a solution to urban disaster or crises, as evidenced by the precedent of the Victory Gardens during 2 world wars. And the kind of thing that we expect the garden to fix is, again, wide-ranging, from food security to basically, it seems like it could fix anything. Which is interesting because we also have a historical precedent of going through the ebbs and flow of our interest in urban agriculture. So oftentimes, even though it seems the urban garden fixes so many things, when the disaster or crisis ends and we go back to normal time, these lands are usually returned to better uses, whether it's housing or retail or other kind of urban development. And so that's another thing to keep in mind, that this has happened before, and it didn't really not have a permanent lasting impact in the city. I'm framing today's talk in a theoretical field of sociology of disaster, and particularly the social recovery theory. And these theories focuses on a social dimension of recovery that tends to focus on the physical recovery. When we say rebuilding, we're quite literally sometimes talking about rebuilding houses, structures, infrastructure. But the scholars like Catherine Tierney and her colleagues have been emphasizing the importance of paying attention to the social recovery. And these 4 dimensions are what they emphasize as very important for us to pay attention to in understanding the variant trajectories of social recovery. Why is it that some communities recover much more quickly in terms of their social redevelopment, and why others actually seem to struggle? Down the road, what we're hoping to engage in this project is to engage with this idea that disaster could be a catalyst for social change. And the question is, what kind of social change? On one hand, we hope that this is actually an opportunity for the just transition. And this is a concept that typically is associated with kind of a fossil fuel, renewable energy type of economy. But I think we can also think about just transition in terms of shifting something like food system, to more just structure as we actually adapt to these increasing changes, whether it's climate change or economic system. At the same time, though, over and over again, we see the evidence that disaster become opportunity for furthering the inequality and perhaps neoliberalistic kind of a market-oriented solution in rebuilding, whether it's physical structure or social fabric of the city, seem to have been evidenced by the scholars who have been observing the post-disaster recovery of many of these cities. And so we wanted to understand where urban agriculture adaptation fit, especially in this particular social and political climate. So with that being said, our research questions are fairly simple, right? What happened to urban agriculture during the pandemic, and how do they try to adapt? Were they successful? And what were the primary obstacles and opportunities in that process? We began the process of interviewing the managers of community gardens, school gardens, and urban farms late summer. Most of the interviews were conducted over the course of the last fall, during the fall semester, thanks to my wonderful 5 undergrad students who assisted me in conducting the interviews. We were able to conduct 32 interviews altogether in Washington, DC and neighboring Arlington County. The reason why wanted to expand beyond Washington, DC is because oftentimes food systems are very regional. And also, as you can see in the map here on the bottom, Arlington is right across the Potomac River from Washington. So they're right next to each other, yet also in a very different jurisdiction in terms of the state and county. And so we wanted to see whether or not proximity actually meant that they're very similar, or even though they're right next to each other, they actually experienced very different impact and recovery processes. The interviews were fairly open. But we asked a few key questions to center the conversations. One was what happened as a result of the COVID pandemic, were there new opportunities and constraints that arose out of those social and economic transitions? What did they do to adapt to those changes? Were they successful? Were they not? And if so, why? And another thing that we asked was, do they anticipate these changes to be temporary, or was there something permanent that they're going to continue even after the supposedly pandemic is over? And that's really where our intentions were, to think about long-term effect rather than just kind of a temporary, immediate solution to the changes. So from this point on, I'll be sharing my findings, and I will be categorizing today the findings into those three different types of urban agriculture: community garden, school garden, and urban farms. And I'm more than happy to go into more detail during Q&A about how perhaps some of these findings vary between Washington, DC and Arlington County. But for now, I'm just going to be talking about them kind of collectively all together. So in general, community gardens seem to have done okay. And part of that may be because many of these are leisure garden, right? These are something that people do on the weekends, perhaps even after work. And there were very little disruption to many of their operations. Social distancing definitely was the major key challenge for many of these gardens, because they couldn't be in the space together or too close together. And also they couldn't share the tools together. And so a lot of the gardeners were now required to bring in their own hoses or other kind of tools that they had to then bring home with themselves when they were done. But these were quickly, communicated via email among the growers, and it seems that there was no major issues there. Few cases definitely did stand out to us. And these are community gardens that are located in predominantly Black neighborhoods where the garden managers were also African American. They seem to have faced challenges in both pivoting, but also primarily because of their lack of resources prior to the pandemic. And so this is where the pre-disaster conditions seem to really made a difference in how they felt the impact, and also whether or not they were able to overcome these challenges. Another thing that we noted was the community gardens seemed to not be networking with each other very well. So one thing I actually failed to mention was that our interviewees were identified by both online searches and snowball sampling by personal referrals, and then also organizational referrals. And so at the end of the interview, we would say, well, are there any community garden managers that do you know in the area that you can point us to? Many of them would say, well, I know of these gardens. I have been to these gardens, but only few of them even knew the name of the other community garden managers or had a phone number or contact information. And so they all seem to be very much operating as a very independent unit. And so the resources what that told us was that the resources were also very much concentrated within the garden. So if people who were participating in the community garden were resourceful, then that garden was going to do well, but that was not necessarily shared across the community garden network. And this was definitely the case in both Arlington County and in DC. Okay. So I also have some quotes just to kind of give you an illustrative sense of how we were picking up on these patterns. So, and I'm not going to read the quotes because I think it's always annoying when somebody reads over when you are trying to read something. So I'm going to give you a minute to read. This is an example of things that are going mostly okay. And it's a subtle reference, but the fact that most of us are working from home, right, to have more time for gardening, tells us about who were the participant of the community garden. In some cases, perhaps they could have been essential, medical workers, but outside of that, this references of we're all working from home really told us that predominantly these were middle class folks that were gardening in these places. And that contrasts to the challenges that were expressed by a garden in Ward 8, which is across on the east side of the Anacostia River. So she's been humorous about, knife fight in the alley to get a kettle, but she's very much aware of the fact that not only that their community garden is lacking resources, but that is not across the board the case for all community garden. And so this was definitely how this particular community garden manager understood as the challenge that was unique to their garden, not necessarily that all community gardens were having a difficult time, which was not necessarily the awareness from the community gardens where things were going well. So there was definitely that disconnect across the city. School gardens seem to have also fared okay by and large, but there were some specific challenges that they faced because of their affiliation and location at school site. And so when the school closure happened very abruptly in the spring, a lot of them definitely were not able to access the site until the access was cleared and clarification was made about the gardening as essential work. So there was a temporary sort of a disruption of the system, especially happening at the height of growing season. So there was definitely a bit of a confusion around that initially. Because these are school garden, oftentimes these are actually not just ornamentally there, but included, embedded within the curriculum of the school's learning program. And so these programs were eventually converted to the virtual learning spaces. This was much more successful for the older kids. So there was one high school where the students were learning sort of a social entrepreneurial skills by working in urban agriculture system. They were already using very much Google Doc and other kind of a virtual learning in class before the pandemic. And so shifting to learning from home was not much of a transition for them. Whereas for elementary school, preschool children, it used to be much more tactile experience of bringing the children out to the garden, feeling, smelling, getting their hands in the dirt. And they were not able to do that very much. And so pivot to virtual learning definitely was a variable experience, even when there was resources for them to at least set up the program. But being able to do the kind of program that they wanted to do was not easily replicable in some cases. A lot of the school gardens also are part of the produce donation or giveaway programming that rely on students to be at school so that they can send the children home with those produce. And because the students are not coming to school, some of them try to continue that by setting up their kind of bags outside of the school, but not all the parents were able to, and not all the students were able to come. And so some of them eventually ended up partnering with other organizations, whether it's a food pantry or other nonprofit that were doing the food giveaway, and had to sort of shift their programming that used to serve directly to their community and the students. And so they were continuing to serve, but not necessarily, their former students. There was a variability within this across the school garden in terms of the access to resources. Whether or not they were partnering with some nonprofit or NGO made a difference in terms of access to resources, distributing information, and also being able to use some kind of a social infrastructure to be able to network. Charter schools definitely took advantage of the flexibility in curriculum building. And so they seem to have been able to adapt very quickly. Whether or not a school had a PTA fund to be able to continue to fund some of these programming, especially as it went virtual and it requires some infrastructural adjustment, seemed to also have made a difference in some of these school gardens adaptation. So similar to community gardens, seems that pre-pandemic conditions did make a difference, but also it seems that the impact was felt slightly differently because of the school. And site maintenance was not disrupted because most of the, in 90, I think 100% of the case, children were not the ones that were taking care of the garden. And so once adults were able to regain the site access, those continue. So in a way, the gardens are looking fine. Who's accessing the garden and what is happening in the garden actually has changed pretty drastically. The role of nonprofits seemed much more prominent than it was the case for community garden. This might have to do with, again, the curriculum side of the school gardening, but we're still looking in to see if there are cases where school gardens define without these kind of external support. And so we are kind of looking into that. But what we're picking up on is that it seems that the school gardens might be able to just go back to normal as soon as the school reopens, right? Because most of what they were lacking during the pandemic will be there. And so that's also similar to community garden. It seems that once the pandemic is over, they could just go back to how things were, although the question is, will they? And so this is a quote from one of the nonprofit that operates several gardens at public schools across the Washington, D.C. And it seems the assessment was that some good, some bad, maybe some long-term changes. And then again, this is just to show the centrality of some of these nonprofits. So Friends of Urban Agriculture is a prominent urban agriculture supporting nonprofit. And this was not just one time, several of these school garden managers actually said something along these lines. And so the question is, what if they were not there, or perhaps there were some other school gardens that were not affiliated with the Friends of Urban Agriculture, what happened to them? And that's something that we certainly are hoping to look into down the road. Finally, urban farms. So this is where the most variable outcomes were, partly because this is, you can see there are so many different kinds of ways to engage in urban farming. Some of them are for-profit, others are non-profit. Some of them use hydroponic, others actually are growing in-ground. Some of them actually are doing more of a commercial sales, and others are doing retail. And so a lot of that, and some of them deliver, to home and the CSA, and others actually just go to farmers market. And so that variability also then created so many different impacts and on so many different forms of adaptation. And so this is probably one category that we really want to look much more closely in the process of data analysis to really begin to tease out what enables some of them to adapt more readily than others. But in general, all of them reported increase in food demand and public interest, which comes back to my very first slide, where a lot of people, consumers, were feeling anxiety around kind of unreliability of the industrial ag system, and also perhaps paying more attention to what they eat because they are cooking at home. And so definitely the demand was up, which is really a good change. At the same time, though, many of them had to face the reality of decreased volunteer capacity because many of them, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, rely on volunteer labor, and that kind of intimate work was no longer safe. And particularly for the businesses, there was an additional precaution that had to be employed for the food safety as well as the public safety precautions. And so that affected their capacity to produce and distribute food. They also had to either scale back or completely shift to virtual those in-person programming that they were running, particularly for nonprofit, but also for-profit, had those tasting or a lot of the cooking demonstration and such, and those certainly could not go on as before. Adaptation strategies varied, but what we noticed was that there was definitely a distinction between for-profit urban farm and nonprofit urban farm adaptation. So for-profit urban farms, whether or not they had to shift from commercial to retail, quite a few of them were selling to restaurants. And then when the restaurants started to shut down, they had to figure out what to do. And this is where, similarly to actually the rural farms not being able to shift the production of milk that was supposed to go to school school lunches to the regular kind of a quart size, gallon size milk packaging, they had to quickly adapt to selling produce that were meant for restaurant use to individual retail. Some of them successfully started new CSA, were able to recruit new customers fairly quickly because of the increased demand. Customers are definitely after those new opportunities, but they had to make quicker decisions because vegetables take some time to grow, right? And so it takes, even for something like microgreen and lettuce, it still requires certain planning, and depending on the kind of growing infrastructure that they were using, sometimes they had to reconfigure entirely, especially if it was like hydroponic. They couldn't just yank the produce that was growing and put something else in. They had to kind of reprogram the whole system. And so whether or not they were able to make that kind of infrastructural changes had a lot to do with their own resources and also previous experiences and their capacity to do that very quickly. Some of them shifted to non-urban agricultural income, using their skill set. So some of them went into more of like a green space maintenance. So they were not really growing, but they had the skill set of horticultural skill set that they were able to use to continue to at least have some income. There were at least 2 cases, I believe, of these for-profit urban farms being able to successfully secure PPP. And so those are definitely a very specific adaptation to for-profit urban farms. By contrast, nonprofit urban farms certainly shifted their programming to virtual, but a lot of them kind of leaned into their social justice, social services programming. And then a lot of them seem to have increased their capacity to donate food or help assist and distribute food. And so that was definitely a very interesting sort of a difference in trajectory of what they decided to emphasize in their adaptation strategies. There wasn't really a specific urban agriculture related policy or mandate or requirement. The only confusion, as I said before, was whether or not that was essential work. And once that was clear, it seems that it was sort of a pretty open to interpretation. And so that seemed to have given urban farms a lot of space for innovation. But at the same time, lack of funding really restricted their capacity to be able to adapt, especially in cases of a nonprofit. They were definitely, of the 3 categories, best network with each other. So there was a lot of a collaboration that was happening across these urban farming projects. We are looking to see if this was happening across these jurisdictional boundaries. So are all the urban farms in DC connected only to urban farms in DC, or are they connecting to Maryland or Virginia, or even perhaps globally in terms of sharing resources? So that's something that we certainly are still kind of looking more carefully into in terms of the pattern. So to give you some illustrative quote example, this is an example of basically doubling the interest in their CSA programming. And this is a case of nonprofit urban farm shifting to the produce giveaway. But there are also some costs that they had to accrue because of these changes that they had to adapt to. So I want to now shift to kind of begin to summarize these findings, coming back to these 4 kind of dimensions of social recovery. So certainly there seems to be some major impact of the pre-disaster conditions. There's a lot of variability across urban agricultural type in terms of what kind of access, what kind of resources they had, and also forms and scale of production that they were engaging in. Some of them had a lot more autonomy in management and decision-making over others. And also where these sites were located within the district or the county, and also who the leadership were, seemed to definitely have made a difference in terms of in preparation for the disaster. In terms of the impact of the disaster, there seems to be a very clear differences across community garden, school garden, and urban farms. And some of that has to do with the pre-disaster conditions, but others seem to be also about the nature of the disaster. And I think this is really something that's really important to keep in mind. it seems to me that the community gardens and school gardens will be able to go back to normal, right, as soon as the pandemic is over. But I think there's going to be a different kind of impact, I think, for the urban farms, because something has shifted fundamentally in terms of their capacity to sell to, say, restaurants. Some of these restaurants are still not open. In terms of their capacity to respond, this comes back to pre-disaster conditions seems sort of very important to keep in mind. And certainly access funding, resources, and time was a really key part of their capacity to pivot, but also the networking across project, whether or not they were networking or not. In some cases, it seems the community garden were okay, right? Not really networking with each other, although the ones that really needed resources were kind of shut out of that opportunity. So we're looking again to see that kind of kind of networking really makes a difference. Rigidity and flexibility of a growing format, again, whether or not you're just growing in a growing box or have a complex system of growing, certainly creates a different kinds of capacity to pivot. This very much is specific to urban farms, but for-profit or nonprofit certainly created different priorities as they were making transitions. And I want to sort of reiterate again that most of these adaptations, even for urban farming, were very much localized, which I think is something to kind of keep in mind in thinking about how these shocks are absorbed and whether or not that's actually beneficial that it was a localized, because that creates a lot more of an innovation, adaptability, right? Very specific to what the local needs are. At the same time, perhaps there is a benefit to centralized, right, approach to make sure that the resources are distributed evenly, and also perhaps there's no replication of effort. But that's something, again, that we're kind of still looking into in looking forward. So we don't really have a whole lot for the post-disaster condition per se yet, because we're still kind of seeing where things might be going. But one of the things that we want to see is whether some of these temporary changes are going to be a permanent changes. Especially for the nonprofit, it seems that some of them really were given opportunity to rethink the role in the community and the new kind of programming that they started. That might stay, or maybe they will go back to the programming that they used to have, and we would like to see why that is the case. Conversations around structural injustices definitely came up a lot more with the nonprofit urban farms, but elsewhere it was relatively silent, which is very interesting, especially with the community garden, where some of the community gardens certainly seem to have very much struggled when others were doing totally fine. And I think that lack of awareness does come from the lack of networking with others, but also it seems to be the case where, yes, this is not an equalizer disaster, right? Where everybody is feeling the impact equally, but there are definitely a group of people or type of urban ag that seem to have been impacted negatively. And perhaps this is a question of whether or not those who felt the impact most severely may have been the one that really needed these in the community. So that's something that we would like to address further down the road. And just quickly touching upon policies, we have to really think about the variability of urban agriculture project to think about policy. What makes sense as far as kind of advancing urban agriculture policy? Should we have a specific policy for, community garden, school garden, and urban farm, or even within that, perhaps we have to think about the differences, and maybe those are not the best category. We might need to rethink these categories beyond kind of a superficial, right, kind of a format, but maybe there is a different way that we can kind of develop the typology of urban agriculture. So that's sort of the kind of direction that we're headed. So we're still hoping to engage with this just transition or disaster capitalism discourse down the road. We're still kind of in an early phase, and I would love to pick up on this during Q&A. And then as far as the data collection, so Caroline Bullis, my collaborator, has been conducting interview in Prince George's County, which is actually right to the northeast of Washington, DC. So once completed, we have basically kind of a 3 contiguous spaces of 3 different jurisdictions that may have adapted to, that certainly probably have adapted to pandemic differently. And so our hope is that beyond just these 3 types of urban agriculture, we can actually then redo the analysis in terms of how things are different across these 3 places. We're really hoping to look for less successful cases. Most of the people that responded to our inquiry to do an interview were the ones that were able to make and proud of their adaptation. And just today, or just yesterday, we finally heard back from one school garden manager whose simple 1-sentence response was that, not much to say, just got to restart next year. And this is where we thought, no, we need to talk to you, right? Because this is something definitely went wrong. And I think we're definitely not hearing back from people who had a lot more challenges. And that's probably also going to change once we were able to include them into an interview, what we were able to kind of analyze as the obstacles across. And perhaps down the road, we also will be interested in interviewing some of these organizations that seem to have been so central to some of these project successes. And so that's where we are right now. So thank you all so much for your attention. Here's my contact and the names of all my students.
Thank you. I get to do the clap because everybody else is muted. But thank you very much for this. Really, I think, interesting to hear everything that you were finding in DC and Virginia. So we can open it up now for the next 20 minutes to Q&A. If folks want to put questions that they have in the chat, that would be great. And Sarah and I can sort of moderate those. And I can maybe get us started with a question that I have. And I am sort of interested in this question around proximity that you started at the beginning. And if you see relationships between what's happening in the district versus what was happening in Arlington. And 2, I keep thinking about the lack of commuting that's happening now in places like DC, and whether or not people were mostly already growing in their backyard, and so that didn't matter in their neighborhood, or if that, no longer moving across the neighborhoods in the same way has had much of an impact.
Yeah, no, excellent questions. So in terms of differences between DC and Arlington, there are certainly notable differences. One, there was only one urban farm in Arlington because Arlington is far more developed than DC, even DC. And so I think most of the interviews that we were able to do was community garden and school garden. So that, right off the bat, it's kind of a different context because it's very urbanized space. And just to kind of add on to PG County, we're actually trying to figure out how far does urban go? There are people who are like, I have 15 acres. Is that urban? And so we can kind of see the variability even already just in terms of the scale of what constitutes urban ag. But beyond that, I do think that there is a differences in terms of who we're engaging. There's also demographic differences between DC and Arlington. At the least, Arlington is not as diverse, although it is diverse, but in terms of the people who are engaging in urban agriculture, it seems a lot more white, middle class, or even wealthier than that. In DC, there was a lot more variability in terms of the population. In PG County, Prince George's County, it's actually even more diverse than DC. So even just demographically and also socioeconomically, I think the variation perhaps might be even more in both DC and Maryland cases. And so I think those social and perhaps political contexts in which urban agriculture happens, I think is something that we need to definitely keep track of as we begin to compare those 3 areas. And I think changes in the workforce seem to definitely have impacted, but I think really in community garden spaces, because again, this is where a lot of the people seem to have more time, supposedly, and wanting to do these things because they were stuck at home. And so that time that you gain, particularly if you're used to commute an hour into the city or two, I think those are extra time that people now have to be able to tend to their garden. A lot of them seem to also have started their own private garden, which is not something that we looked into. But the wait lists seemingly have increased in all of these community gardens. And so people seem to want to do this in a social setting as well.
Yeah, that's great. And really interesting to think about how people are gardening in different ways, right? Starting in their backyards, but also growing the wait list to the community gardens.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a handful of comments and questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to start working our way through them. And I am going to be awful at names as I read them out. So, but our first comment says, thanks a lot. This resonates a lot with surveys that they have done in France and some other in EU countries. And so too, I think really important to be thinking about how this resonates in cities all around the world.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah. We have a question from Lennon Caro, who's here in Charlotte, and says, when you talk about disaster capitalism, which I think of Naomi Klein in the aftermath of Katrina, are you talking about strictly the increase of inequality, or perhaps the expansion of neoliberal values like individualism, competition, flexible labor, etc.?
I'm thinking both. And I think those are kind of a mutually sort of reinforcing conditions, I think. And so when I think about urban ag in relation to that, in some ways, urban ag actually could be a very much sort of almost like anti-capitalistic, radical movement. At the same time, it could easily be co-opted. And I think that is actually increasingly happening in urban agriculture, even in DC. Last few conversations that I've had with the new urban ag interest was a container garden. It has a very much kind of that tone of kind of a Silicon Valley startup type of, urban ag. And so I do think that we have to be careful about not assuming that urban ag is necessarily just, or that, it's necessarily politically conscious or, interested in social equity. It could very well be, deployed as a part of the green gentrification, and perhaps again, kind of a part of the neoliberalistic, way of, absorbing these ideas that used to be belong to progressive ideology, and perhaps adopt this precisely because it's kind of a, appeal of sustainability and, green, to actually enhance inequality rather than address inequality.
That's great. And I can see Lennon nodding his head as you were chatting and responding. So we have another comment or question from Plaxides Chitio. And she says, thank you for your talk. I have a question on the lack of networks in community gardens versus the urban farmers. Were you able to get a sense of organizations that support community gardens versus urban farms? And what were the demographics in terms of race in community gardens and urban farms?
No, excellent question. So in Washington, D.C., community gardens, largest network of community gardens are connected to Department of Parks and Recreation, which is a city agency. My understanding is that there isn't much that this agency does. It doesn't really provide resources. It's just an affiliation that allows them to have some information, also perhaps some resources and maintenance, but very little. And so yes, they're affiliated, but that's really doesn't really do more than just having a little plaque on their gate, essentially. In Arlington, Friends of Urban Agriculture is nonprofit, so that already makes a little bit of a difference in terms of their status. But they seem to be a lot more proactively engaging the gardeners, the community gardens. I know that especially with the school garden, there was at some point some competition about, largest amount of food being produced, so the schools are competing with each other. So there's a lot more activities around to network these different gardens. And so I think, again, the role of these organizations to proactively connect or not, I think made a difference in whether or not they knew each other. But I think urban farms being connected to each other has little to do with this organizational facilitation. They're younger people. They're much more active in social media. They're also, I think, actively really seeking each other because perhaps the nature of urban agriculture requires more than just your personal leisure activity. When you produce something, you're supposed to do something with it. And so by nature of the kind of work that they do, they ended up wanting to find other folks whose work is relevant to them. And so I do think that the age and also the nature of urban farming that facilitated those networking, I think. So it was definitely more of a grassroots, right? Sort of they sought each other, not rather than that somebody was actually connecting them intentionally.
Great. So the next question that we have is from Lauren Forbes, who says, thank you for your presentation. How are you defining urban farms that do not fully fit into either nonprofit or for-profit categories?
An excellent question, and that's actually one of my new research projects on social enterprise. We're not really necessarily making any distinction as of yet, but I would like to see how their adaptation actually may have been different. And in fact, I think distinction between for-profit and nonprofit is rather challenging sometimes in urban farming space, at least. There are nonprofit farms that do a lot of market activities as part of their income. And then there are a lot of for-profit that does a lot of the community interfacing work. And so I think maybe ultimately that kind of a distinction is really superficial tax status. And we might need to also create a category that's more based on what they do rather than paperwork says. But I think you're really onto something in terms of, again, the nature of their work, beyond growing food, what is their priority? What is the mission of the growing? And so when that is interrupted, what becomes their priority in the process of adaptation? And I do think that that is really where these kind of a neither or either, a little bit of both kind of status that urban farm oftentimes occupied might really be a good place to look to see why some of them actually adapted so quickly, compared to others.
That's great. And it seems really important to me to be thinking about that as you look into sort of policy approaches, right? And how local governments are supporting these projects. So next we have a question from John Kenny, who says, can you talk a bit about crop yield adjustment? With recent snow, ice in the Midwest, and I understand in DC this week as well, a lot of those farms now have zero net yield. And how can those farms gardens adjust?
Excellent question. And this is another one of those things where community gardens just close in around Thanksgiving, right? Like that's kind of at the end of the year. And they do typically have these kind of a community kind of cleanup party of a sort. And then they just close the garden down. School garden also kind of goes with the ebbs and flow of the school year, which is always kind of awkward because I think the height of the production, is basically when the school is enclosed. So I think those two factors, I think kind of not exempt, but seasonality was not a big concern for the community garden and school garden per se. For a lot of the urban farms, I think they are either indoor. There's very few greenhouses. And so I think there are not really typically growing as much at the scale during the winter time. I know that they're starting back up again soon, but that's an interesting question, I think, as far as how they're planning forward, actually. And this might be also very regionally specific question too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, our lack of snow here in Charlotte extends our growing season just a little bit. So we next have a question from Dylan Turner, who says, thank you for this wonderful talk. Similar to another question above, did any people interviewed mention solutions to bridge networking communication gaps that made operations harder?
Surprisingly, not so much. We definitely had a question in an interview where, you know, do you feel like you're not getting sufficient information? You know, do you feel like there are some other ways that you could have accessed information? And by most of the interviewees said, well, I was able to access the information about, you know, what was required in terms of the social distancing or, you know, health, public health requirement online. It was very consistent what I was getting from the government, at least the local government. And So it seems like they weren't sensing that there was a lack of communication, although obviously there were some of them that seemed to have been left out of the communication. Um, of the ones that we were able to speak to, it seems like lack of information was not exactly seen as major detriment. What we do see though is that there were definitely people who are not part of the network. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we seem to have been talking to people who are plugged in, more or less, and they were saying, I think we did fine. What we want to know is who weren't connected and therefore weren't getting the information that many of them seem to so easily have access. And so that's one of the reasons why we really want to talk to people who did not adapt as well. But that's an excellent question.
That's great. So next we have a question from Aubrey Hagan. This is, thank you so much for this presentation. I was really interested when you pointed out that pre-disaster conditions shaped capacities to pivot, as I've noticed this in my research this year, specifically the networks relationships that organizations had before the pandemic. Did you notice any demographic patterns, and what types of organizations and gardens had more networks and social support?
I do that, and this is very preliminary, so I'm hesitant to sort of say this conclusively, but I would say that age, class, class and race kind of intersecting, age, class, and then also the type of urban ag, I think made a difference in again, sort of communications and networking. So in Arlington, it seems that it was a very predominantly white networks of urban gardeners, including the people who are assistant from the organizational side of it. And then also seems very resourced, both in terms of kind of a capacity, economic capacity, but also they have been experienced in garden growing. And they seem to be very well connected to each other in terms of sharing information about that. But young and younger people in DC also seem to be just as well connected, regardless of their race. In this case, it seems more class and education background seem to be the key here. Yeah.
That's great. So we have a comment now from Flora Henderson that says, the irony is that many poor communities are home to immigrants whose primary way of living was farming. They bring so much knowledge about traditional farming that could be rescued. And I don't know if you saw any sort of those demographics coming up in your research around immigrant communities.
Yeah. Interestingly, we have not really tapped into immigrant farming, which is also another blind spot, I think, in our data collection. I don't think there is as robust of immigrant urban gardening currently in DC as compared to, you know, Los Angeles or New York City. But I think to understand the history of it for sure, I would like to know where there could have been, maybe smaller scale. That again, it's not picking up on online searches. It's not right. They're not connected to predominantly white or college educated urban farmers network. And so they don't know each other. It doesn't mean that that doesn't exist. And so, but I do think that that would be interesting pocket where this kind of self-sustaining practices pre-existed and then continue to feed people in the community without, right, many of us really even knowing that this is happening. And I think it is important to acknowledge that, and we want to be able to capture those in our data for sure.
And in my mind, it's also sort of connected to the challenges of doing research during the pandemic, right? It's not as easy to just walk around and, knock on the gate of a garden and talk to somebody as it used to be.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, certainly this did come up in Black communities, Black neighborhoods in DC. And what was really notable, though, again, this is sort of a unique nature of the pandemic as a disaster. I think there were definitely a lot of the community, older folks in a community that would have probably been interested, but because COVID was definitely very much a high risk for the AIDS and also other pre-existing conditions, that they really were not coming out. And so that was also kind of an additional layer of concern in terms of who felt more at risk being outside rather than being free to be outside. And I think that really kind of says a lot also about who they are in terms of pre-existing condition personally, not necessarily kind of a collective way at these gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have 2 minutes and one last question, so I think our timing is working out. So we have a question from Stephen Silvern, who says, well, not part of your research per se, I'm interested in urban connections to CSAs in the DC metro area. Have you observed increased CSA memberships and food delivery to urban locations? Would be interesting to study urban ag as part of this large local regional food economy. I wonder how adaptation is occurring at this spatial scale and the degree to which it will persist post-COVID.
And answer is yes. It definitely ballooned. And I think part of that also was that the rural ag shifting, right? Because they were adapting from being able to do wholesale to restaurants and other places, and now they actually had to find new customers. And I know that, for example, actually I joined the CSA, the new CSA, which was a Lancaster organic cooperative farmers. And when I looked at the map of where the pickup locations were, and clearly they added quite a few, in recent years, and the number of people who are participating seems to be really expanding. And this is where I think it's also important to keep in mind the sort of the wealth that's concentrated in DC and places like Arlington County. And I think when people who are doing this for profit shift, they need to find people who are able to afford, right, their produce, and they're not necessarily evenly distributed across geographical spaces either. And so I think it would be interesting if somebody interested in picking up on this project is to kind of figure out where these new produce, right, not just in terms of producer side, but consumer side, who is actually gaining more access to these local organic or, local sustainable food, and maybe where it's not going at all. I think that would be a really interesting question to look into for sure. And I think that's definitely where we have to think regionally rather than just, urban, meaning just here in the city, for sure. So that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Wonderful. So the last comment that I'll second says, thank you, Yuki. Excited to see where this project goes. And so
thank you, Devin.
You very much. And thank you everybody for coming and for your really thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.